The hum of alien voices filled the air as Lieutenant Sarah Lewis stepped into the grand hall of the Xylophane Academy, a place of learning that spanned galaxies. This was no ordinary school. Located on a massive floating station orbiting a distant star, the Academy was a beacon of intellect, gathering the best and brightest species from across the cosmos. And yet, as Sarah walked into the vast, circular chamber, she felt like a speck of dust in a universe that had long moved past Earth. The walls around her shimmered with light as if made of living energy, a technology far beyond anything humanity had yet developed. Various alien students sat at consoles, holographic interfaces floating before them, their eyes scanning complex equations and intricate star maps. These beings, from telepathic races to those made entirely of liquid metal, all had one thing in common. They were far more advanced than humans. Sarah's arrival had caused a stir. While Earth had only recently joined the intergalactic community, humanity's reputation was still in its infancy. Some species viewed Earth as a curiosity, others as a primitive world, but none saw humans as serious competitors on the galactic stage. Sarah herself, the only human student here, had been chosen for this prestigious program as a representative of Earth, a sign of hope and ambition for the future. But so far it had felt like a struggle. The other students rarely spoke to her. Conversations, when they did occur, were stilted and awkward. Her fellow students had centuries of knowledge and tradition behind them. Advanced technology, telepathic abilities, and the ability to manipulate energy. Sarah, by comparison, was just a pilot, a veteran of human space travel with some technical skills and a penchant for problem-solving. But here, her skills seemed insignificant, as though she were out of her depth. Today, however, something was different. A sense of anticipation hung in the air as the students gathered in the central auditorium. A subtle buzz of conversation filled the space, and Sarah overheard snippets of words she couldn't understand. It was as if everyone had already heard the same story. And then, standing at the front of the room was Professor Zilther. Zilther was a towering figure, his body composed of constantly shifting geometric shapes, glowing in shades of blue and green. His race, the Xylophans, was ancient, older than most of the students present by far. His species had long been the intellectual leaders of the galaxy, and he had designed the curriculum at the Academy. There was no being in the galaxy who could match his intellect, and the riddle he was about to present was something no one had ever solved. Sarah shifted in her seat, feeling the weight of the moment. Zilther's reputation was well known. He was a being of few words, his mind sharp and precise. To him, puzzles weren't just intellectual exercises. They were reflections of the very nature of existence itself. And the riddle he had designed was legendary, rumored to be so difficult that no species, not even the telepaths or the computational geniuses, had ever come close to solving it. Today, you will attempt the riddle of Rith Khan, Zilther announced, his voice carrying across the auditorium. This riddle has baffled every species that has ever faced it. I do not expect any of you to solve it. His words hung in the air, a challenge as much as a statement of fact. The students leaned forward, eager to see how their minds would grapple with the puzzle. Sarah, however, felt a flicker of unease. The idea of solving something no one else could was intimidating, but she couldn't help but wonder what would happen if she were able to crack it. Zilther raised a hand, and a hologram flickered to life before him. Strange, flowing symbols appeared, shifting and rearranging as if alive. The riddle took form in a series of abstract geometries, incomprehensible languages, and cryptic phrases. Understand this, Zilther continued. Rith Khan's mind is not bound by linear thought. It is not bound by any one form of perception. Only through true understanding and understanding beyond what is apparent can one hope to grasp it. Do not expect logic to be of use. The room fell silent. The other students, their minds trained on higher forms of intelligence, stared at the holographic puzzle, already furrowing their brows. Some began whispering amongst themselves, their telepathic minds trying to make sense of the riddle in a way no human could possibly fathom. Sarah's heart raced. She was no mathematician, no telepath. She wasn't even sure what she was supposed to do, but she had spent her life finding patterns, making connections in the chaos of space, where a slight miscalculation could mean the difference between life and death. She was a problem solver, if nothing else. Zilther's gaze swept across the room, his expression unreadable. You have 1 hour. Solve the riddle. If you cannot, I will reveal the answer. But I doubt any of you will come close. The clock started ticking. Sarah knew this was more than just an academic exercise. It was an opportunity to prove that humanity, despite being newcomers to the galactic stage, could think in ways no other species could. If she could just grasp the riddle, even for a moment, she might just have a chance to show them what humans were capable of. The holographic display shimmered before Sarah, its intricate patterns shifting with an eerie fluidity. The symbols, neither words nor numbers, floated in midair, each one more perplexing than the last. The room was heavy with tension as the other students, each brilliant in their own right, studied the riddle with deep concentration. Sarah, however, felt a strange sense of calm. She wasn't sure if it was the weight of the challenge or simply the novelty of it, but something about the riddle felt different. It wasn't just the shapes, the geometries, or the cryptic nature of the symbols. There was an underlying rhythm to it, something almost musical. Yet, Sarah knew better than to rely on intuition alone. She had to think, analyze, and perhaps even take a different approach entirely. She glanced around the room. The other students, all from vastly different species, were silent but intensely focused. A telepathic being, whose head was a mass of ever-shifting light, had its eyes closed, mentally analyzing the riddle in ways Sarah couldn't comprehend. Another student, from a race of beings that communicated through bursts of sound, was humming softly, as though trying to find some resonance within the symbols. Yet none of them seemed to be making any progress. Professor Zilther stood at the back of the room, watching with his usual expressionless demeanor. His shifting body seemed to pulse with energy, but his eyes betrayed nothing. Sarah could feel the pressure mounting. There was no way to know how far the others had gotten, but she could sense they were all struggling. She could practically hear their collective thoughts, loud, filled with confusion, frustration, and hesitation. Sarah's eyes moved back to the symbols, trying to see beyond the confusion. There had to be a pattern, something simple that none of the others had noticed. Suddenly, her mind flashed to a thought, an idea that was both absurd and intriguing. She wasn't looking for the solution in the way the others were. They were trying to force the riddle into their understanding, applying the logic and structure of their own species. But Sarah had always found that real breakthroughs came from thinking in ways no one expected. She was, after all, human, and humans were good at looking at things from a completely different angle. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. The riddle wasn't meant to be solved by brute intellect. It wasn't just a puzzle to be cracked. It was a reflection of the way the universe itself worked, elusive and contradictory. It was about perception, about seeing the unseeable and understanding the impossible. Without hesitation, Sarah stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. She took a step forward and spoke, her voice breaking the stillness. "I think I have it," she said. The room seemed to freeze. All eyes turned to her. The telepathic student's gaze flickered with curiosity, and the sound-based being fell silent, its harmonic vibrations ceasing. Even Zilther, who rarely showed any outward emotion, seemed to shift ever so slightly, his glowing eyes fixed on Sarah. "I believe the riddle is asking us to consider what we don't see, what we can't measure, and what we can't predict," Sarah continued, speaking more to herself than to anyone else. "It's not about logic. It's about breaking the boundaries of what's possible. The solution isn't found in the symbols, but in how we perceive them." Zilther's eyes narrowed. "Interesting," he murmured, though he said nothing more. Sarah's words hung in the air, a strange feeling rising in her chest. For the first time since she'd entered the academy, she felt like she was on the verge of something. The other students were still staring at her, but none of them seemed ready to challenge her. They were all deep in thought, processing what she had said. Sarah sat back down, her heart racing. She wasn't sure if she had truly solved the riddle, or if she had just stumbled upon a new way of thinking about it. But she knew one thing for sure: her approach was different from theirs. She had broken free from the pattern of thought that had kept the others locked in their intellectual box. Professor Zilther stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "You believe this is the answer, Lieutenant Lewis?" he asked. "I believe it's a new way of looking at it," Sarah replied, trying to steady her nerves. The professor did not speak further, but his silence was more than enough. The riddle remained unsolved, but the shift in the air was undeniable. Something had changed, and Sarah had made the first step. Whether it led to success or failure, she had proven that humanity had something different to offer the galaxy. And for the first time, she felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as out of place here as she had thought. The room was still. Not a single sound filled the air, save for the soft hum of the holographic riddle, now slowly fading. Sarah sat there, her pulse pounding in her ears. Had she said too much? Was she deluding herself into thinking she'd cracked it? Professor Zilther had not spoken since she offered her interpretation. His eyes, glowing faintly in the dim room, were fixed on her. There was no judgment in them, no immediate dismissal, just an eerie stillness. The alien students, too, remained silent, staring at Sarah, some with curiosity, others with skepticism. For a long moment, the Academy's grand chamber felt more like a tomb than a place of learning. Sarah's heart skipped, and for a brief second, she considered retracting her statement. Maybe it wasn't right. Maybe it didn't make sense. Maybe the others had found something she missed. But then Zilther moved. He took a step toward the hologram and, with a wave of his hand, the symbols slowly disappeared, replaced by a new series of flowing shapes. He turned, his form shifting slightly as he locked eyes with Sarah. "Explain," he said simply, his voice low but carrying a weight of authority that made every word feel like a command. For a moment Sarah froze. This was the moment of truth. The professor's gaze was unblinking, and the air was thick with expectation. She could feel the weight of the other students' gazes upon her, their telepathic minds probing at the edges of her thoughts. She cleared her throat and stood slowly, trying to steady her nerves. "I believe the riddle is not a traditional puzzle. It's a question of perspective, one that forces us to break free from conventional reasoning. It's asking us to think beyond the physical, beyond the observable, about the space between the symbols and the assumptions we make about them. The answer isn't in what we see, but in what we choose not to see." The words came out more fluidly now, as if they had been waiting inside her, ready to spill out. It's about perception, about understanding the limits of logic. The riddle itself plays on those very limits. You can't solve it by applying the same intellectual tools that have worked for you all your lives. You have to be willing to let go, to challenge everything you thought was true. A flicker of something passed through Zilther's eyes. Surprise? Intrigue? For the first time, Sarah saw something other than the cold, impassive gaze he usually wore. She felt a strange surge of pride. But the room remained eerily quiet. Sarah's thoughts raced. Had she lost them? Was her answer too human? A moment later, Zilther stepped back. He regarded the room, his alien eyes scanning the students one by one. Then, without warning, he turned to the holographic display. With a swipe of his hand, the image shifted once more, the symbols rearranging into a new form. Sarah could feel the weight of his scrutiny. He spoke, his voice softer now, but still filled with power. "You claim that the answer lies not in logic, but in perception. Is that what you believe, Lieutenant Lewis?" "I do," she said, finding a new confidence in her voice. "It's about seeing the riddle as a challenge to our very way of thinking. Not everything has to be solved with brute force. Sometimes, the answer is in understanding what's unspoken." Zilther remained silent for a long moment. The other students were watching, but none dared speak. Sarah felt the pressure of their eyes, but this time it was different. Instead of feeling small, she felt an odd sense of unity, as if her words had struck a chord with them. Perhaps they didn't fully understand, but they were listening. Finally, Zilther spoke again. His voice steady but with an undertone of respect that made Sarah's chest swell with quiet triumph. "Your interpretation is unorthodox, but there is wisdom in it. His gaze flickered toward the other students. The riddle is designed to make you think in ways that defy your nature, to ask questions that have no answers. But in your answer, Lieutenant Lewis, you have demonstrated a different way of thinking, one that none of us had anticipated. The other students shifted uncomfortably. The telepathic student's light form flickered, as if confused. The sound-based being hummed quietly, perhaps reconsidering its earlier thoughts. Sarah caught the briefest glimpse of surprise in their eyes, an acknowledgement that they were struggling with something they had never considered before. Zilther turned back to Sarah. You have not solved the riddle, but you have pointed us toward a new path of thought. In that, you have done what no one else has, opened a door that no other species thought to look for. The room was still again, but this time, the silence wasn't one of defeat. It was one of contemplation, of quiet respect. Sarah sat back down, her heart pounding in her chest. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was the exhilaration of knowing she had done something no one else had. The other students were still unsure, still processing the shift in thinking. But for the first time, Sarah felt like she truly belonged. And in that quiet moment, she realized something. Humanity had a way of thinking that no one else could match. A way of approaching problems that was as unpredictable as it was powerful. A way that just might be the key to unlocking the secrets of the universe. The days that followed the riddle's challenge felt different. The weight of the room had shifted, and with it, the tone of Sarah's time at the academy. Where once she had been the outlier, the only human in a sea of far more advanced species. Now, her presence seemed to command a quiet respect. She hadn't solved the riddle, but in a way she had redefined it. Her answer, her interpretation, had broken through the rigid intellectual traditions of the galaxy's brightest minds. The other students no longer avoided her. Instead, they sought her out, eager to hear more of her thoughts, to understand the human perspective she had offered. The telepathic student, who had once been the first to dismiss Sarah's abilities, now approached her in silence, offering flashes of approval in his mind. The sound-based student, whose vibrational language had been so alien to her, now spoke with a renewed interest, eager to learn how Sarah had connected the dots in ways that they hadn't considered. And then there was Zilther, the professor who had once regarded her with a clinical detachment, now seemed to view her with a sort of cautious admiration. The cold, unblinking gaze that had once left Sarah feeling small and insignificant had softened. He'd begun to engage her more directly, encouraging her to think about problems in ways she had never considered, challenging her ideas, forcing her to refine them. He seemed intent on pushing her to develop the very thing that had caught his attention. The human way of thinking. Your mind is unfettered, Zilther had remarked during one of their late discussions. You are not bound by the constraints of what is known, and that makes you unpredictable. I suspect this is something the galaxy will have to come to terms with. Sarah had no idea how to respond. How could she explain the human drive to explore, to create, to push boundaries in ways that other species couldn't? How could she explain the wild, passionate curiosity that fueled human progress? Zilther's words lingered in her mind, but she didn't have answers. At least not yet. One morning, Sarah sat at a table with several students from different species, all deep in discussion. It was strange. They were no longer just students and a representative from Earth. They were peers, each offering their own insights. She was no longer the newcomer, the outsider. The respect she had earned wasn't just from solving the riddle. It was from her willingness to think differently. In one of the quieter moments, the telepathic student turned to her, his form shimmering with a faint blue glow. I had underestimated you, Lieutenant Lewis, he said, his voice smooth, almost musical in its resonance. Your perspective, it's unlike anything I've encountered. I had thought we, the telepathic races, could perceive everything. But you have shown me that there is more to understanding than we thought. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, Sarah felt a wave of pride wash over her. She wasn't just representing humanity. She was redefining what it meant to think like a human in a universe of beings who had thought themselves superior for centuries. The galactic community had always considered itself the pinnacle of intellect, with species like the xylophones and the SCI ruling over the arts of logic and deep thought. But now they were beginning to question their assumptions. Sarah had proven that humanity, with its rough edges, its creativity, and its unpredictable ways of thinking, had a place among the stars. And then came the final test. Zilther, during one of their many conversations, asked her a question. What do you believe the future holds for humanity in this galaxy? Sarah had paused, thinking for a long moment before answering. I think we'll surprise everyone, because we're not bound by what others expect. We'll create, adapt, and change in ways no one can predict. And eventually, we'll show that there's more to intelligence than what you can measure or calculate. Zilther's glowing eyes regarded her thoughtfully, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the edges of his lips. Perhaps, the galaxy is full of answers, Lieutenant. But sometimes, the greatest strength lies in the questions we dare to ask. Sarah smiled back, a small, confident smile. She wasn't sure where her journey would take her, but for the first time since arriving at the academy, she felt like she had found her place in the vast, infinite expanse of the galaxy. Humanity wasn't here to simply survive. It was here to shape the future, and no one, no matter how advanced, could stop that.